Have you ever had the fear of being buried alive? Well, if you've had, you're not the only one. It was quite a common fear in the 17 and 1800s to be buried alive. But don't worry, they could get around that. And that was by getting the safety coffin. What's a safety coffin? Let's have a look. And welcome back to the Brac Shop, the portal to the supernatural, the paranormal, unexplained, the spiritual, all the unknown things that probably will be explained in the future by quantum physics. And I'm Tom from the shop. So, the safety coffin, quite a good device if you had a fear of being buried alive. Now, that was a fear that was actually quite, a lot of people actually had, and that was being buried alive. In Canada, during one of the epidemics, I think it was smallpox actually, where a girl had caught the disease and she was ill, and the doctor came and looked after her, and then she fell into a coma for maybe about 2 weeks or so and then died. So the doctor came in and had a look at her and said yes, she was dead, and had her buried. Now time went by, and I think probably about 10 or 15 years later, they actually had to dig up the coffin. I'm not really quite sure why. Maybe they were reclaiming the land, so moving all the coffins. But they dug this coffin up, and they found out that they'd buried her alive because she had actually moved in the coffin, and the side of the coffin was actually bashed out. So she was trying to get out. And, well, maybe she ran out of air and finally suffocated, because she would have been buried 6 feet underground. And just think that, trying to crawl your way back out. And don't forget, being in the coffin, it'd be quite dark. In fact, you wouldn't be able to see anything in there. So imagine that turmoil and that horror of waking up inside a coffin and not being able to get out. Quite frightening. And that was a fear that a lot of people were scared of. So this fear was sort of common around America and Europe at the time, the 1700s and 1800s. The American writer Edgar Allan Poe also had a fear of being buried alive. And he actually wrote it in a few of his stories as well, like The Fall of the House of Usher is one example. Now, don't forget, if you enjoy this episode, click the like button and subscribe if you haven't subscribed as yet, and click the bell so you'll be notified every time I release a new video. Now, the safety coffin was to put your fears at rest. If you should die, well, you didn't really die, but if people thought you were dead before you were actually dead, you would be able to get yourself out of the coffin or notify people that you hadn't died and be able to be dug up again. Now, in 1791, Robert Robinson in Manchester, in the United Kingdom, or Britain, probably as it was known then, when he died, he was actually buried in a coffin with a glass casing, a glass lid. And that way, and he was actually put in a tomb, so it was a bit different from being buried. But, and also they had the watchman, the cemetery watchman, going past the tomb and looking in through the door to see if the glass would fog up with the breath. And if it fogged up with the breath, it meant he was alive, and so they would go in and get him out. And that was one of the earliest reports of someone building, of someone making a coffin where they could be noticed if they were still alive. But the first recorded case of actually someone building a safety coffin was in 1792, and that was in Germany by Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick. Now, he had a coffin that was made that actually had a glass window, so he could look out or someone could look in, and he also had a piping into the coffin, a tubing for air as well. And he also had a lock on the coffin. So the lid wasn't nailed shut, it actually had a lock, and he was buried with 2 sets of keys. One for the coffin and one for the tomb. Again, he wasn't buried, he was actually placed in a tomb. So if he should have woken up, he would have been able to unlock the coffin and unlock the tomb and leave. Probably something where we get the idea for vampire movies and horror movies of people leaving their coffins and tombs and wandering and returning back before sunrise. But that was another means of a safety coffin. Now, a few years later, in 1798, P.G. Pesler, who was a priest, again in Germany, suggested that all coffins be made with a device in case someone was buried alive. And this device was a cord, a contraption that someone could pull the bell, and that would be connected to the church bells, and be able to notify people if they'd woken up buried deep underground. It was also an idea to actually put a tubing in so the caretakers could regularly come along and breathe the air in the coffin. If they could smell decomposing smells, you could say the body was decaying, and so the person had died. And if there was no smells, they'd be on the alert in case someone should wake up, and they would be able to hear their cries for help, and so get them dug out. And into the 19th century, the 1800s, Dr. Adolf Gutsmuth, I hope I pronounced that name correctly, he actually demonstrated a safety coffin where he was buried alive, and there was actually a feeding tube as well. So while he was waiting to be dug up again, he could actually have a meal so he wouldn't have starved. And they actually served him a whole meal, including dessert, down there. Imagine in the darkness. I'm sure they had some sort of lighting. If he knew he was going to be buried, I'm sure he had some sort of candles or something. But you never know. It might have been through touch that he had his meal. Because you would think things could have gone up in flames if you lit a candle in the coffin. After all, don't forget, this was back in the days before electricity and before anyone had any proper powered lights. I suppose they could have had an oil lamp, but still, spillage and stuff like that, you could have gone up in flames. Now, again, in Germany, and still in the 1820s, they actually devised the portable death chamber. Now, this was actually a contraption that was placed over the grave, and the coffin would be on top, or be in this contraption. And there would be a window and also a bell attached. And the caretakers would come around regularly to see if the body would start to decay, or if they were still alive, if they'd woken up, and they'd be able to rescue them. Now, if they noticed that the body was decaying, then there was a contraption at the bottom of the chamber, and the bottom would open up and the body would drop into the grave, and a panel would cover the grave up. And then the chamber would be taken off to the next burial site. So there was a few of these coffins around, usually with a bell and with tubing devices where they could get air, they could get food while they were waiting to be dug up again. Now, a lot of these practices carried on through the 19th century. But in Edinburgh, for example, that was a bit of a different case there because they had the body snatchers, so they were called the grave robbers, because Edinburgh was the centre of medicine in the early 1800s. So they needed bodies to do research on. And so you had the body snatchers, where they would actually go and dig up a newly buried grave and take the body to the hospitals, where they would be paid quite well for each body. So that was actually an underground thriving business. In fact, there was the case where these two robbers were actually digging a body up. Now, there was nothing really against the law about stealing a body, but there was if you took the jewelry that was on the body. So a lot of the people, a lot of the grave robbers actually took the jewelry off and left them in the coffin and took the body to the hospitals. There was this one case where they were digging this body up. It was a woman and she had a lot of rings on her fingers. Now they were taking the rings off, but one of them actually got stuck, and so they started to cut the finger off. Now while they were cutting her finger off, she actually woke up and gave a great big scream. And of course you can imagine the grave diggers gave a great big scream as well and ran off. But it saved her life. But that was one of the incidents that actually brought in a new way of determining if someone was actually dead. But there's also the case of Bric and Hares, two men that weren't actually grave robbers. They actually murdered their victims so they could actually give them to the hospital so they could get a nice payment for it. But that brought in the new medical certifications to say someone was dead, and that helped as well. And that was in the early 1830s. But of course today we have the autopsy, and usually no one survives the autopsy. So any fear of being buried alive is actually stopped in the mortuary. So I suppose you could develop a new fear of being murdered in the mortuary, in case someone thinks you died, but you hadn't died and then they cut you up. But the safety coffin, in fact, it wasn't such an outdated idea, because in 1995 there was a new patent for another safety coffin, and this one had an alarm, of course, an intercom system, a flashlight, and also equipment like a heart monitor and a stimulator as well. So it wasn't that long ago. But as I've said, most people go through an autopsy that makes sure that you're actually dead before you're buried. So that's something to think about. That you can rest assured that the chances of being buried alive these days is very slim. So what do you think about that? Do you have a fear of being buried alive? Write your comments below and let me know. And whether being the thought that you'd have an autopsy actually relieves that fear a bit. And don't forget, if you've liked this episode, click the like button and share it. Discuss it with your friends as well. And if you haven't subscribed as yet, please subscribe and click the bell, so you'll be notified when I do release a new video, because I want to delve on the unnatural, the strange, the bizarre, and have a look to see if there is an explanation, which I think will all be revealed through quantum physics. Because I am feeling, because I'm doing some research into it, like quantum entanglement. Is that really part of the collective consciousness and telepathy? I'm going to do another episode on that. And there's a few more other subtopics you can say that I want to look into as well. So if you subscribe and click the bell, you won't miss out on those ones. So I hope you found this episode interesting. And until next time, stay well and happy. I'll see you soon.